please mark 420 as our song of encouragement after our lesson this morning, which time we'll sing the first and last verse. Our lesson this morning is a continuation of the lesson series we began a couple of weeks ago on where we got the book we call the Bible. I want to again explain the lack maybe of scriptures contained in these lessons. But as you can well imagine, it is hard to do a lesson like this on the book that contains the scriptures when the scriptures themselves really do not talk about its own history as a book. And so it's necessary to have lessons like this, and when you think about it, it is a good and beneficial lesson, because how many of us would like to know that we had actually been asked by someone to place our faith, our eternal faith, in a book of which we know very little of its whereabouts and how it came into being? And so a lesson like this is very beneficial to us and should be, even within our own faith, even though we are not, in this case, using a lot of scriptures in these particular lessons to learn about the history of the book that contained the scriptures. But we also know that we're learning to fortify our faith in realizing that there is much evidence attesting to the reliability of the scriptures as we have it. And this morning I want to continue that lesson. And this continuation will also conclude this lesson series. And I thought that it would be a good idea for us to conclude these lessons by looking at an emerging false doctrine, especially among certain sects of the Baptist denomination known as King James Version Onlyism, or the belief that only the King James Version, sometimes referred to as the Authorized Version, is a reliable translation of the Bible, and that it is in fact believed by some to be the only reliable translation of the Bible, and in fact some believe it to be an inspired translation, being that God miraculously inspired King James first to produce this translation, and those whom he chose to do the translating. There are many obvious issues with such a belief system as this, not the least of which is the belief that God continued to miraculously deal with man and a known false teacher, being King James himself, over a period of 1,500 years past the death of the last living apostle. Let us examine now in a bit more detail one of the most popular translations of the Bible, known as the King James Version, sometimes referred to as the Authorized Version, because the translation was authorized by King James to be translated. Most of us know that the Lord's one true church began around 33 AD, and that beginning is, of course, recorded for us in the pages of the New Testament. And specifically, we read about this in the book of Acts, chapter 1 and chapter 2. From our history of religious denominations, we know that the Catholic Church and the Catholic Church actually began 292 years later, approximately around 325 AD, and then split into the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church around 1054 AD. And then sometime around 1534 AD, English king by the name of King Henry VIII of England desired to annul his marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, because she failed to produce him any male children to inherit the throne. And so he broke from the Catholic Church when they would not let him annul his marriage to his first wife and simply marry someone else who would or might bear him a male child to inherit the throne at that time. And this is, of course, how the Church of England came about being. King Henry broke with the Catholic Church and began his own church called the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And this, of course, is where we pick up with the story, the historical story, rather, of the King James Version, being that King James I was actually a great-nephew of Henry VIII. King Henry VIII had a sister who was the great-grandmother of King James I. And King James I is the namesake of the 1611 King James Version. King James I became King of England in 1603, and he bounced between religious views, it seemed, although some sources say and claim he was a lifelong Protestant and not a Catholic, but that is not true. Other sources speak of him as being influenced or raised in Catholicism and also being of the Presbyterian belief, and then also dabbling in the Anglican belief as well. Of course, such a sordid history of religious beliefs, all of them being false, for God to supposedly choose someone like this to breathe into, being what the word inspired means, his various unknown translators, the ability to translate an inspired King James Version would be unlikely. Who would pick someone so religiously unstable, even in the eyes of men, to inspire, to create a perfect Bible? But such is the claim nonetheless by some, but that history gets even more obscure as we continue to learn about it. Before we begin looking at the King James Version as simply a book and how it actually came about, as far as the materials that those who worked on the translation took in the translation, let us notice some interesting history just about this translation from the actual preface of the 1873 edition of the King James Version. This is a quote or a section of the King James Version taken from the 1873 edition, the preface that is in the very front of the 1873 edition. This is what is said concerning the King James Version. It says, "The most time-honored and widely used edition of the English Bible is the translation of 1611, commonly known as the Authorized Version or King James Version. But though it has served as the standard translation for millions of users through nearly 4 centuries, there has never been a standard edition to which all printings are conformed. No two early printings of the King James Version were identical, not even the 2 printings of 1611, and no 2 modern settings are identical either. These differences are due to accidental human error, as well as to intentional changes by printers and editors, who sought to eliminate what they judged to be the errors of others and to conform the text to their standard of English usage. This said, most differences involve only spelling, punctuation, and italics, and few variations materially affect the meaning of the text. As early as 1616, there were systematic attempts to revise and standardize the King James Version. Other important early editions were issued by Cambridge in 1629 and 1638. In the 18th century, the 2 great English universities, who were also officially chartered printers, commissioned thorough and systematic revisions. The edition of Dr. F.S. Parris was published by Cambridge in 1762, and that of Dr. Benjamin Blayney of Oxford in 1769. Though far from perfect, these remain the standard editions until the Cambridge Paragraph Bible of 1873. The Cambridge Paragraph Bible began with the simple plan of arranging the text of the King James Version according to the sense of the literature, arranging the prose sections into paragraphs and the poetic section into parallel lines. This simple plan, however, was enhanced by the editor's desire to create a most thorough standardization of the text ever attempted. To this task, Dr. F.H.A. Scrivener devoted 7 laborious years, from 1866 to 1873. Because the translator's original manuscripts no longer exist, the King James Version text must be established by consulting the earliest settings. Dr. Scrivener compared at least 15 early settings and important revisions, including both settings of the King James Version of 1611 Bibles, version from 1612, a version from 1613, 1616, 1617, 1629, 1630, 1634, 1638, and 1640, and the significant additions of Dr. Paris in 1762 and Dr. Blaney in 1769. So, to recap what we've just looked at in the preface of this 1873 edition of the King James Version, these are some things that we should have noticed, hopefully, from that preface. There has never been a standard edition of the King James Version to which all printings are conformed, meaning that not even the original translation created is considered to be a standard by which the various other editions soon followed, one of which was even done that very same year. The 1611 original was done in 1611, and by the end of 1611, they had already came out with a revision of it. Number 2, we should have learned no 2 early printings of the King James Version were identical, not even the 2 printings of 1611. No 2 modern settings are identical either, the preface said. I find that very strange, considering that this is supposedly an inspired edition, according to some people. We also read in that preface that it is due to accidental human error that these editions are not identical. That they also had intentional changes by printers and editors. If the original and translators had been miraculously inspired to create the King James Version in 1611, why would there be errors allowed in it that were due to accidental human error and intentional changes by the printers and the editors? That simply does not make sense. And then we see that because humans wrote it and thought the earlier humans that had done the ones before them had made mistakes, some mistakes did happen because of accident and intentional changes by the printers and editors. And of course, it's said that the English language continued to change, as it continues to do to this very day, we know. And changes were made to fit modern standard in change, which was never a standard to begin with. But just how many changes did the King James Version go through? Well, we know it went through 2 in the very first year that it was established. But how many others did it go to? Or through, rather? Well, according to the same preface that we just read, the 1873 version, it said there that they had 2 versions in 1611. They had a version of it 1 year later in 1612, then the next year in 1613, 3 years later in 1616, a year after that in 1617, and then 12 years after that in 1629, then in 1630, 1634, 1638, and 1640. And then 2 significant additions in 1762 and 1769. Well, what were some of the changes that were made in these different revisions that we read about here? Well, it should be interesting to most of us and this study that the original King James translation, as well as all of those up through 1666, it included what is called the Apocrypha. The original King James Version included 14 additional books that is not currently in our King James Version Bible. There were 80 books in the King James Version original in 1611, and the Apocrypha books also stayed in the King James Version up through 1666. And they were not removed, even though during that time there were no kind of evidence that those books were ever inspired. And so the 1611 version had 14 extra books in it in the Old Testament that was supposedly dated somewhere between 200 BC and 400 AD, and that were never considered to be inspired writings, but yet those books were inside those earlier versions of the 1611 translation. Well, if you find these points interesting, you may also well find the following facts about the King James 1611 book simply as a Bible, as the material that was used for it, even more interesting. So we've been studying of late the oldest manuscripts in the original languages of the Bible were Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And these were dated by scholars as early as the 4th century, somewhere around 200 plus years after the last living apostles, from 300 AD to 450 AD. And yet the dates that they were discovered, and hence available for circulation and use by the scholarly world, was not until after the 1611 version were completed. So the 1611 version could not have used the most earliest manuscripts that we have been studying about to be produced. We learned that the most ancient manuscript, the Codex B or Vaticanus, was written somewhere around 300 AD. And it was included in the inventory in the Catholic Church around 1475 is the earliest mention. But around 1845, a little over 400 years later even, a Dr. Samuel Prideaux Tregelles made a trip to Rome to view the Codex and was overshadowed by 2 Catholic priests that would not let him open the volume without searching his pockets, depriving him of pen, ink, and paper, and would try to distract his attention if he seemed to concentrate on any one page of that version very long, and eventually they snatched the book away from him. We also learned about the Sinaitic or Codex Aleph, that it was discovered from a period of 1844 to 1859, but was written somewhere around 325 AD, about 225 years after the death of the last apostle. But it was not available until a little over 200 years after the King James Version was translated, because it had been hidden from the public and was just eventually found in 1844, bits and pieces of it, and then the rest was secured in 1859. So the question, and then of course the other ancient manuscript that we looked at was the Alexandrian Manuscript, which was written somewhere around 500 AD, and it did not even make it into England until around 1628. And so that was even, 17 years after the 1611 translation was made, so they didn't know anything about it then either. So the earliest translations, even though they were written many, many years before the 1611 version was translated, they were not available. They were not known about and made available to the people who were translating the 1611 King James Version. So the question we must answer is If the King James translators were not inspired to pen this version of the Bible that had to have so many revisions throughout the years, and they did not have ancient manuscripts available for them to do this in their translation, what exactly did they use to produce the King James Version? Well, the answer to that question is that the translators of the King James Version used only a portion of Greek text, not ancient manuscripts themselves, to arrive at both the Old Testament, done in Hebrew, and the New Testament, done in Greek. The translators used what was called the Textus Receptus to translate the New Testament, which was a Greek text of the New Testament. And they used a book that we may be familiar with called the Septuagint, which is a Greek copy of the Old Testament, to translate the remaining part of the King James Version that was missing from the Textus Receptus, which included the entire book of Revelation. So they used modern-day Greek sources of material to come up with the King James Version that was written in three different languages, and they only used one particular source of modern-day Greek, or at least 12th century Greek, to translate and to come up with the King James Version. A little bit more that's interesting about this particular book called the Textus Receptus is that its history tells us that it was created by a man who was a Catholic humanist, whose name was Decidius Erasmus of the 15th century, and he was responsible for the Textus Receptus. In his attempt to make a reliable Greek text, he only consulted 5 or 6 Greek texts that he could find, none of them being any older than the 12th century, whenever he created the Textus Receptus, which was the book that they made the King James Version translation from, or at least the New Testament portion from. And so, even the books that they used to create the King James Version has no history any later in original manuscripts that you can trace, except back to the 12th century. The point I'm making here, in case some have missed it, is that there is no hint of divine inspiration from the material used to translate the King James Version 1611, or the King James Version 1611 Bible itself. It cannot be inspired because of the material that was used to translate it. While the King James Version has been steadily improved over its several revisions, it never was inspired directly from God, and the material from which was used to create the King James Version was not inspired directly from God. They were copies, late copies of the 12th century that was created, and of course the Septuagint, which we know was even in the Septuagint itself had been in use even during the days of Christ for the Old Testament. It was a Greek copy of the Old Testament. But this is the truth of the matter that many people still want to try to ignore. And those of our friends who have pledged their very religious being on an inspired King James Version translation have to simply ignore the true history of it coming into existence in order to believe and to try to teach that it is an inspired translation. History does not agree with that, and there is no way of proving that the King James Version had inspiration involved in it at all. Not only this, there is no unity in belief, even in the doctrine of King James Onlyism. For there are at least 4 different various views of King James Onlyism in the world today. and I want to briefly mention those. There are some who just prefer the King James Version as being a better translation, which is not harmful in the least as long as one does not try to bind that belief on others as a law. And then there is the belief that some see it simply as a superior text, believing that the Textus Receptus and Hebrew Scriptures are closer to the apostolic ones found later, but this view does not hold up in light of the historical evidence, as we've noticed. And then there are some who believe the Textus Receptus, used in part to create the King James Version, was itself inspired, but we have no evidence of miraculous inspiration to examine, or even a claim of such, past the end of the first century. Plus, we have already noticed that this original Textus Receptus contained the Apocrypha books, the 14 missing books, as they're called, from the Bible dated between 200 BC and 400 AD, which scholars generally agree are not inspired and never have been. And then lastly, there are those who believe that Old King James I, the religiously confused man that we have looked at this morning and have briefly talked about, was himself, as well as his 6 panels of unknown translators, numbering somewhere between 47 and 54, depending on what source you read from, because nobody really knows how many translators he had or what their names were. This is just an educated guess that some makes. It was somewhere between 47 and 54 translators. No one knows what their religious views were. And we know the religious views of the man King James himself, because history tells us that, and we know his name. But we do know that there is a man who took part in the translation, in that he wrote the preface for the original 1611 version of the Bible, and he is a man by the name of Miles Smith, a name which all of us should easily remember because we had a friend whose name was Miles Smith. But he clearly stated that the people who translated the original King James Version were fully aware of their own ability to make mistakes in their work from place to place, and that their work would also require correction and improvements in the future. Edgar Goodspeed quotes Smith as saying this in the preface of the 1611 version of the Bible, and this is a very short quote. But notice what this man who was there when the Bible, the King James Version, was being translated, what he said in the preface. He said, "No cause, therefore, why the word translated should be denied to be the word, notwithstanding that some imperfections and blemishes may be noted in the setting forth of it." So Miles Smith was there. He wrote the preface, and yet he admitted in the preface that there would be blemishes and issues that would need to be corrected in the 1611 version. And thus there was, even the very same year that the 1611 version was created, there was another 1611 version created soon after. And then the next year after, and the next year after, and several more years after. And revisions continue to take place as evidence comes into play by historical and archaeological finds. All of the evidence that we have today was not available at that time. And even some of the evidence that we have today and have access to, that it did exist during that time, was not made available to everybody to view and to use. Smith was correct in saying this, just as we have noted during our study. The mistakes of mere men in reproducing the Word of God are overshadowed by the fact that we have over 5,000 pieces of ancient manuscripts that prove that the Bible we hold in our hands today is the Word of God. But it is the words within, the message within these translations that is inspired, that came from God. It is not the translations themselves. This Bible is the most attested to book in existence in this way, as well as numerous other ways that we could have discussed in our lessons. We may have never heard of ancient church fathers before, but these were historians and philosophers that wrote history during the first century and thereafter. And they quote numerous and various passages from the Bible, enough that the scholars say that we could put together an entire Bible just based upon what historians quote from it. Secular historians quote from it. The Bible has more evidence existing today to prove that it is the true Word of God than any book that we can find. But we must place our faith in the message and not in the translations that come about that are the work of human beings. Because human beings can make mistakes. We must not go to extremes in thinking that God extended the miraculous gift of inspiration in the doing of this past the life of the last apostle, when there is absolutely no proof of this and plenty of proof against it. We have everything we need to provide us with evidence of the sonship of Jesus Christ, His willingness to die in our stead as the redemptive cost for sin that we owed, to repent of that sinful life that we have been living, and to turn and walk in newness of life after we have confessed our faith publicly and had the guilt of our past sins washed away, clearing our conscience and adding us to the church in our obedience to baptism. This same book then provides us with patterns of the form of local government that we are to have at each congregation that is autonomous, to guide us in our work and worship while showing authority from the book for each and everything that we do in the name of religion. Many King James Onlyists today tell us there is no value at all in researching the ancient languages that the Bible was originally written in, and then they turn around and make a false claim to inspiration to this version, which is their pet version, all the time realizing that it contains, or should be realizing that it contained 14 books that they probably reject. And yet that book was supposedly inspired in the original form. But it contained 14 books that they now reject, most likely. Because I don't know of any King James versions today that people are using that contain the Apocrypha books. There may be some splinter groups that do, but the majority of people do not have those books in their Bibles, their King James versions. That mindset would not have worked in the days of Erasmus and others who produced the source material for the King James Version, like the Textus Receptus, which makes the King James Version onlyist somehow odd in their way of thinking. They reject everything that the people, all the methodology that the earlier people who produced their material, that helped to produce the King James Version, they reject every bit of that, in saying that their material or their pet book, the King James Version of 1611, is the only inspired version. The analogy that I've used in the past to illustrate the false idea of an inspired translation is a simple analogy. It is concerning that of a sack of seed that someone would go to the farm store and purchase. When one gets there and looks at the package and realizes that there are mistakes in the words of the printing on the package, the packaging material has tears in it, the words are slurred and maybe misspelled and maybe not printed correctly, and yet that does not affect the integrity of the seed inside the package. You see, men created the packaging, but God created the seed. And that is the analogy that I use when I talk to people about this, to try to help them to understand that it is the seed, the message, that we should be concerned about, and not the packaging material. The packaging was done by men. There may be mistakes in these, because as we've noticed, our original Bibles were not written this way. Our original Bibles were not broken up into upper and lower case with punctuation. They were not broken up into individual verses, into paragraphs, into anything like what we see in our modern day translations. And yet we can know that we have the Word of God even with these changes and even with the few errors that are contained within it, because of the evidence we have. When somebody finds new evidence in archaeology, they go back and they look at the translations that we have, and they prove that these verses belong in the Bible. It was just like what we have studied before, and we might get into a study like this in the future about some of the verses that people say don't belong in the New Testament. If you look at the Britannicus and the Sinaiticus, you will notice that the last few verses of the book of Mark are missing there. But we've mentioned this before. Those ancient manuscripts that we have actually leave a blank in that area in the manuscripts. The people that made those manuscripts knew those verses were in question even at the time they made them, 300 years later. But for some reason they left a space for it but never wrote them down. And it's very odd that if Mark chapter 16 ends at verse 8, the end of that verse would end with the word for. That's a strange way to end a sentence, isn't it? To end a whole book. Have you ever ended a letter to somebody with the word for? For is meaning that you have something else to say. For if this is the case, for means for the reason, or something like that. Why would they just end the letter of the Gospel of Mark with the word for? That doesn't even make any sense. But I've got a book at home that's as thick as our songbooks that discusses all the different reasons why we should trust the fact that the last few versions of the verses of the book of Mark actually belong in the book of Mark, even though the oldest manuscripts did not have them in them. The Alexandrian Manuscript did, and also the Washingtonian Manuscript did. And there are numerous other pieces and writings that show that those verses belong in the Bible. And there are other such verses that we could point out that people have questioned in the past as well. And yet, even if those verses did not belong in the Bible, we could turn to other verses that teach the very same thing as what those verses say. When you think about what Mark chapter 16, verse 9 through 20 actually tell us and teach us, we can turn to other places in the Bible that teach the very same thing. Even if scholars were incorrect, and that those verses don't mean what they don't belong there. We've got other verses in the Bible that they don't argue about that teach the very same exact thing. And so this type of a lesson is not made to discourage us concerning the Bible, or even the King James Version for that matter. It is to help us understand exactly how the King James Version came into being and how we arrived at the book called the Bible in the first place. And so hopefully everyone has benefited from this lesson. And if you have any questions along these lines or want to go any deeper into a study of these things, just let me know, and I've got the material and stuff at home in my library. I've got several excellent books and excellent source materials for this. World Video Bible School has actually done a study course on this, and I have that study course material at home in written form that goes into much more detail than what we have looked at here this morning and in our last few lessons. But the most important thing that we need to understand from this study is that the Bible is the inspired Word of God, not the King James Version necessarily, but the message that it contains is the inspired Word of God. And we can get that inspired Word of God from other sound translations. But there has been some translations that have been twisted by man to teach false doctrine, like the New International Version and other such versions that we could go into this morning if we had time. But the one that we currently use here and try to encourage others to use is the King James Version, the New King James Version, or the American Standard Version. And all three of these versions are very sound, even though they do have areas in them that need further explanation. We can learn how to become Christians from these translations, and we can learn how to live a faithful Christian life that will carry us to an eternal home known as heaven, if we simply read and study and obey the things that these translations tell us. And that's the important part of having a lesson like this, is being able to explain to others where their Bibles came from and why we should base our eternal destiny on this book we call the Bible. If you have needs to respond to the invitation this morning, it has been given to you. If you have a need to repent of public sins as publicly as they're known, we also give you the opportunity to do that. Whatever your needs are, please make those needs known as we sing the invitation song.